I'll fix it. The billionaire looked down at the 6-year-old girl standing beside his silent car and slowly shook his head. The late Arizona sun burned low across the highway, casting long shadows from the open doors of Brooks Auto Repair. The garage sign rattled faintly in the warm wind. Dust drifted across the cracked pavement, settling on chrome that had no business being there. Daniel Whitmore had built machines far more complicated than this one. His company designed next-generation hybrid systems for urban transit. Investors described him as visionary. Engineers described him as demanding. Right now, he was stranded, and a child in oversized overalls was studying his vehicle like a seasoned mechanic. "Sweetheart," he said carefully, keeping his voice polite but firm. "This isn't a lawnmower, it's a performance hybrid. I'll wait for the mechanic." Annie didn't step back. "My grandpa is the mechanic," she replied. "Good," Whitmore said quickly. "Then call him. He's not home." Whitmore paused. "Not home?" "He went to Mesa for parts." "How long?" "Couple hours." That answer landed harder than he expected. Whitmore turned away briefly, pulling his phone from his pocket. No signal. He paced toward the road, lifting the device higher as though elevation might create connection. Nothing. Behind him, Annie had already begun walking slowly around the car. She didn't touch it. She listened. Engines spoke in patterns. Her grandfather had taught her that before she learned to spell her own name. Most people heard noise. If you were patient, you heard meaning. She crouched near the rear wheel well and tilted her head. "It's not the battery," she said calmly. Whitmore turned. "Excuse me?" She stood and moved toward the front, peering carefully through the narrow openings near the grill. "The battery light came on, didn't it?" she asked. His jaw tightened slightly. "It had." "That doesn't mean you understand what it indicates," he replied. Annie ignored the tone and continued circling the vehicle. She paused near the passenger side, bending slightly to listen beneath the chassis. "There's a clicking," she said. "Back here." Whitmore stepped closer despite himself. "There shouldn't be any clicking." "There is," Annie answered. She walked back toward the hood and looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, not defiant, just certain. "It's overheating near the fuel relay. And something's loose." Whitmore stared at her. The fuel relay system in that model was custom configured. Not common, not obvious. "You read that somewhere?" he asked sharply. Annie shook her head. "I heard it." He felt a flicker of irritation. This was how expensive mistakes happened: overconfidence, curiosity, unauthorized hands inside machinery that cost more than most people earned in a year. "I appreciate the enthusiasm," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "But I can't have you poking around in there. If something gets damaged, it's not a simple fix." "I won't damage it," she said. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Whitmore exhaled slowly and pinched the bridge of his nose. This was absurd. The sun dipped lower. The air began to cool just enough to remind him that night in the desert arrived quickly. Still, no roadside assistance. Still, no signal. Annie took one small step toward the hood. Whitmore reacted immediately. "No." He held out his hand. "Don't." She froze. "I just need to open it and—" I said no. His voice wasn't cruel, but it was absolute. "You could short the system. You could override the software calibration. You could make it worse." Annie looked at the vehicle again, then back at him. "It's already worse," she said quietly. He didn't answer that. From inside the garage, an old country song drifted through a dusty radio. The American flag on the back wall shifted slightly in the breeze. The smell of motor oil and warm metal filled the air. Whitmore stepped between Annie and the car now, protective without thinking. "Listen," he said more gently, lowering his tone. "I'm sure your grandfather lets you help. That's fine. But this car isn't something you experiment on." "I'm not experimenting. You're 6. The words hung there. Annie's chin lifted just slightly, not in rebellion, but in simple fact. "And you're stuck," she replied. Whitmore almost smiled at that, but pride stopped him. He checked his phone again. Nothing. He glanced at the empty stretch of highway, then back at the little garage that looked like it had been there since before his first startup pitch. This was not the setting he was accustomed to surrendering control in. Annie folded her arms. "If you wait," she said, "it'll overheat more." "That's not how residual thermal buildup works," he said automatically. She tilted her head. "Yes, it is." For a moment, he said nothing. The ticking sound beneath the hood continued faint, uneven. Whitmore heard it now. He waved his hand again, firmer this time. That's enough. Step back. Annie obeyed, though her eyes remained on the engine. He walked to the driver's side and locked the car with a soft electronic beep, as though sealing it off from interference. I'll handle it, he said. When your grandfather gets back, tell him. Daniel Whitmore stopped by. Annie watched him carefully. You're not listening, she said. Whitmore straightened his jacket. I listen to engineers every day, he replied. I don't take mechanical advice from children. He began pacing toward the edge of the road again, searching for signal, leaving the silent vehicle behind him. Annie stayed where she was, the wind tugging lightly at her overalls. The car ticked once more. Not random, not harmless. She looked at it, then at the man who had built an empire on innovation but couldn't hear what was right in front of him. And the desert evening settled in, patient as ever, waiting for someone to finally listen. The desert sky had turned the color of fading embers when Daniel Whitmore finally stopped pretending he still had control of the situation. He stood at the edge of the road, staring up at the wide Arizona horizon as if it might offer instruction. The last light bled slowly behind distant rooftops. A single star appeared. Then, another. The heat lifted from the asphalt in quiet waves, carrying with it the smell of dust and metal. He checked his phone again. No signal. For a long moment, he simply stood there. In boardrooms, hesitation was weakness. In negotiations, delay meant leverage. But out here, under an open sky that didn't recognize wealth or reputation, hesitation felt different. It felt human. Behind him, the silver vehicle ticked unevenly. And beyond it, Annie waited. Whitmore lowered his arm and exhaled through his nose. Then, without another glance at the road, he turned and walked back toward Brooks Auto Repair. Each step felt deliberate. Annie watched him approach but didn't speak. Inside the garage, a single hanging bulb cast a warm glow over worn tool benches and neatly arranged wrenches. The American flag on the back wall shifted gently in the breeze drifting through the open bay. The radio had gone quiet. Whitmore stopped a few feet from Annie. You're very sure of yourself, he said. Annie shrugged lightly. I'm sure about the car. He studied her face, no arrogance, no nervousness, just calm, certainty. He looked toward the open hood release latch, then back at her. Before we go any further, he said slowly, we're going to set some terms. Annie didn't move. Whitmore stepped closer, lowering his voice, not threatening, but firm in the way a man used to contract spoke. If you open that hood and damage anything at all, your family will be responsible. Annie's expression didn't change. This car is worth more than this entire building, he continued. If it's damaged beyond repair, I will expect your family to leave this property. And I will expect compensation. Double the value. The words settled heavily in the warm air. It was an unreasonable demand. He knew it. A reflex born from habit risk management. Leverage. Protection. Annie blinked once. My grandma makes peach cobbler every Sunday, she said softly. Whitmore frowned slightly, caught off guard. And my grandpa built this garage before I was born. She looked around at the walls, the tools, the concrete floor worn smooth by decades of labor. We don't leave. Whitmore held her gaze. This isn't personal, he said. It's business. Annie tilted her head. My grandpa says business is always personal. The statement lingered. Whitmore straightened his shoulders. If, he continued, adjusting his tone, you somehow fix it. If you diagnose the issue correctly and repair it without damage, I will renovate this garage. Annie didn't interrupt. I'll fund a full restoration, new lifts, new equipment, electrical upgrades, whatever your grandfather needs, and I'll invest in it, properly. The wind shifted again, stirring dust at their feet. Annie considered him carefully. And you won't change it? She asked. What do you mean? You won't turn it into something else? Whitmore hesitated. He had bought companies before, invested, expanded, rebranded. That depends, he began, automatically. Annie shook her head. No, she said quietly. If you help, it stays ours. For a moment, he almost smiled. She was negotiating. He looked at the building again, the faded sign, the aging tools, the quiet dignity of a place that had survived simply because it worked hard and charged fair. I won't take ownership, he said finally. It remains your family's. I'll provide capital. No strings. Annie studied him, searching for something. Adults often hid conditions inside promises. She had seen that before, even at 6. You promise? She asked. Whitmore met her eyes directly. I promise. The word felt heavier than he expected. The ticking beneath the hood sharpened briefly, as if impatient. Annie nodded once. Okay. Whitmore stepped aside from the front of the car. Understand something, he said quietly. If this goes wrong, it won't, she replied. He exhaled slowly. You're 6 years old. Yes, sir. And you're willing to stake your home on this. She looked at the vehicle. It's not my home I'm staking, she said. It's yours. If this moment moved you, if you felt that quiet shift from power to trust, take a second to let us know. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe stories about justice, courage, and unexpected faith still matter, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. He didn't understand that immediately, but he moved aside. Annie walked to the driver's side and reached up, barely tall enough to pull the hood release. Whitmore stepped forward and opened it fully, the metal rising with a controlled lift. The engine compartment gleamed under the fading light, precision engineering layered in compact perfection. Annie didn't touch anything at first. She listened. Then she leaned slightly closer, eyes scanning, head tilting as though mapping invisible threads. There, she said softly, pointing near the relay housing. Whitmore followed her finger. A narrow connection line, almost hidden behind insulated casing. That coupling's loose, she said. It's heating wrong. It shut the system down to protect itself. Whitmore leaned in closer. He saw it now, a faint misalignment, barely noticeable. You'd need a torque adjustment, he murmured. Annie nodded. And, cooling, he looked at her. That's exactly what diagnostics would show. She didn't respond. She simply reached for a small step stool near the wall and dragged it quietly into place. Whitmore watched every movement, every breath. The sky darkened fully now, but the garage light glowed steady and warm around them. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar. Not control, not authority, risk, and strangely, trust. Annie placed her small hand carefully near the connection point, not rushing, not guessing. Whitmore stood beside her, close enough to intervene, but he didn't. Outside, the desert night settled in. Inside Brooks Auto Repair, beneath a single hanging bulb and an aging American flag, a billionaire and a 6-year-old girl stood over a machine worth more than pride, and the real negotiation had only just begun. The engine purred the way it had been designed to, low, even, confident. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the driver's door for several seconds after shutting it off again, as though expecting the silence to betray him. But nothing flickered on the dashboard. No warning icons, no hidden alarms. The system remained steady. Across the small garage floor, Annie had already returned the wrench to its exact place on the wall. Not tossed, not dropped, returned. That detail stayed with him. You didn't even hesitate, he said quietly. Annie shrugged, stepping down from the stool. It was just sitting wrong. Whitmore looked back at the hood. Most engineers would have run a full diagnostic. My grandpa listens first, she replied. Diagnostics come after. He smiled faintly at that. The night air drifted through the open garage door. Cooler now, carrying the faint scent of creosote from somewhere down the road. The desert had a way of slowing everything once the sun disappeared. Even Whitmore felt it, a pause he rarely allowed himself. He walked slowly around the car, almost ceremonially, as if inspecting something newly discovered rather than something he already owned. You said it shut itself down, he said. Yes, sir. To protect the system. Yes. He ran a hand along the smooth curve of the hood. We designed that feature, he murmured. More to himself than to her. Preventative shutdown in case of relay instability. Annie tilted her head. It did its job. He looked at her again. Really looked at her. 6 years old, standing in a garage that hadn't been renovated in decades. And she had understood instinctively what trained specialists analyzed through software. What did your grandfather teach you? He asked. Annie walked toward the old wooden bench near the back wall and sat on it, swinging her boots lightly. He says engines are honest, she said. They don't lie. If something's wrong, they'll tell you. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it. Whitmore let out a slow breath. In his world, everything was noise meetings, forecasts, quarterly earnings calls, everyone talking at once. He couldn't remember the last time he had simply listened. You weren't afraid, he observed. Of what? Of being wrong. Annie considered that. If I was wrong, we'd fix it. He smiled faintly. It's not always that simple. She studied him with quiet curiosity. Grandpa says grown-ups make things complicated so they feel important. Whitmore laughed softly at that, an honest sound, unguarded. I might know a few people like that, he admitted. The headlights of a passing car briefly illuminated the garage entrance before disappearing down the highway. The world was moving again. Phones would ring, emails would stack up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Full signal. He stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it without making a call. Your grandfather, he said. How long has he run this place? Since before I was born. And before that? He fixed trucks for the army. Whitmore nodded slowly. That explains a lot. Annie hopped down from the bench and walked toward the old sign leaning against the inner wall, a spare one her grandfather had never hung. The paint was chipped, but the letters were bold. Brooks Auto Repair. Honest work. Fair price. You said you'd help, she reminded him. I did. She looked up at him. You keep promises? Yes. Grandpa says a promise is louder than money. Whitmore absorbed that carefully. I keep my word, he said. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. He walked toward the center of the garage, taking in details he hadn't noticed earlier. The cracked concrete smoothed by decades of boots, the tool drawers labeled in careful handwriting, the faded calendar pinned to the wall still turned to last month. This place hadn't failed. It had endured. You don't need to change it, Annie said quietly behind him. He turned. I know. Just help it rest. That word again. Rest. Whitmore felt something tighten gently in his chest. In his world, nothing rested. Companies scaled or collapsed. Markets rose or fell. There was no in-between. But here, this garage had stood steady, year after year, not chasing expansion, not chasing headlines, just serving whoever pulled into its bay. He walked back toward his car and opened the door once more. The interior lights glowed softly. You understand something, he said, looking back at her. You didn't just fix a car tonight. Annie folded her arms lightly. What else? You reminded me why I started building things in the first place. She didn't respond immediately. After a moment, she said, to make them work? Yes, he said. To make them work. Not to dominate markets, not to impress shareholders, just to make them work. He stepped out again and closed the door. I'll send a contractor tomorrow, he said. Not to replace anything. Just to reinforce what's here. New wiring. Safer lifts. Proper lighting. Annie nodded slowly. And no big sign? He smiled. No big sign. And no changing the name. Never. She seemed to weigh that promise one more time, then extended her small hand. Whitmore looked at it briefly before shaking it carefully, respectfully. Her grip was firm, the kind of handshake that didn't need witnesses. As he finally prepared to leave for real, he paused at the entrance of the garage and looked back once more. Annie had already returned to the workbench, wiping her hands with an old cloth, humming softly to herself, like it had been an ordinary evening, like she hadn't just shifted the perspective of a man who controlled a billion-dollar company. Whitmore stepped into the driver's seat and started the engine one last time. Smooth, steady, he pulled onto the dark highway, headlights cutting through the desert night. In the rearview mirror, Brooks Auto Repair grew smaller but somehow felt larger than it had an hour ago. Because sometimes power wasn't about proving someone wrong. Sometimes it was about admitting they were right. And somewhere behind him, under a single hanging bulb and an aging American flag, a 6-year-old girl who listened to engines had quietly reminded a billionaire what listening truly meant. Daniel Whitmore did not sleep much that night. The hotel suite in downtown Phoenix was quiet, temperature controlled, perfectly insulated from the outside world. Yet sometime around 3 in the morning, he found himself staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of a small wrench turning with absolute certainty. He had built an empire on precision, on engineers who wore degrees like armor, on teams that could calculate torque ratios in milliseconds, and a 6-year-old girl in a worn-out garage had solved what his system had overcomplicated. By listening, he rose before sunrise and stood by the window overlooking the city. Traffic lights blinked below in orderly patterns, everything efficient, everything controlled. Yet something about Brooks Auto Repair had unsettled him in a way no boardroom ever had. It wasn't embarrassment. It was clarity. By 8 o'clock, his executive assistant had already sent 3 urgent messages regarding a product rollout delay in Denver. Investors were restless. The new hybrid line depended heavily on proprietary relay systems, the same kind that had triggered his shutdown yesterday. Whitmore paused mid-scroll. A pattern began forming in his mind. The shutdown had been blamed on isolated environmental variants. That was the phrase the engineers had used. Isolated, environmental, variants. It sounded clinical. It sounded safe. But Annie hadn't used any of those words. She had said it was sitting wrong. He turned from the window and made a call. Pull the full relay batch analysis from Q3. He told his chief engineer. All units shipped to Arizona and Nevada. There was a pause. Sir? We already reviewed that after your incident. Review it again. Another pause. Yes, sir. Whitmore ended the call and stood still for a long moment. He realized something uncomfortable. If a 6-year-old could hear instability in the system before it escalated, then maybe his own company had stopped listening long ago. By mid-morning, he was back on the highway. Not because the car needed anything, because he did. The desert light felt softer today, less aggressive. As he approached the weathered sign of Brooks Auto Repair, he noticed something new. A small chalkboard leaned against the outer wall. Closed until Grandpa gets back, it read in uneven letters. Beneath it, a smaller line had been added. Unless it's important, he found himself smiling. Annie was sitting on the concrete floor near the garage entrance, drawing something with colored chalk. Circles, gears, what looked like a small engine diagram. She looked up as the shadow of his car fell across the driveway. You came back, she said simply. I said I would. She nodded, accepting that without surprise. Grandpa's still not home? He's at the parts warehouse in Mesa. Truck won't start. Whitmore blinked once. Your grandfather's truck won't start? She nodded. Alternator's tired. He stepped out of the car. You're not gonna fix that too? She grinned. Not without him. There was something reassuring in that answer. Whitmore walked toward the garage slowly. I made some calls, he said. She stopped drawing. About what? About listening. Annie tilted her head slightly. My engineers ran another review this morning. Turns out a small batch of relay components from one supplier were improperly shielded. Only shows up under extreme heat variants. She blinked. That's bad? It could be. He crouched down to her level. You helped me catch something early, before it became bigger. She studied his face carefully. You're not mad? No. He shook his head slowly. I'm grateful. She seemed satisfied with that. A pickup truck passed on the highway, horn honking twice. Annie waved automatically. Whitmore noticed. Everybody knows you here? She shrugged. They know Grandpa. That answer lingered. They know Grandpa. Reputation built over decades. Not through advertising. Through consistency. Whitmore rose and stepped inside the garage. Morning light spilled across the concrete floor. The place looked smaller in daylight. Older. Yet, it felt solid. He turned toward Annie. I meant what I said. She stood now. About helping? Yes. A black SUV pulled up behind his car, unexpected and polished. One of his regional managers stepped out. Tablet already in hand. Sir, I wasn't aware you'd be. Whitmore raised a hand gently, just observing. The manager glanced around the garage, visibly confused. This is important, Whitmore replied. Annie watched the exchange quietly. The manager lowered his voice. Sir, the Denver situation. We'll wait. The words surprised even Whitmore, but they felt correct. He turned back toward Annie. Would you show me something? She nodded cautiously. The way you listen, he clarified. She walked to the side of his car and tapped lightly near the hood. Start it. He did. The engine came alive smoothly. She closed her eyes. Whitmore felt the manager watching, perplexed. After a few seconds, Annie opened her eyes again. It's happier today, she said. Whitmore let out a soft breath through his nose. Happier? It's not fighting. He shut off the engine slowly. The manager shifted awkwardly. Sir, with respect. Whitmore looked at him calmly. Do you know how many recalls we've avoided because someone on the floor caught something small? The manager hesitated. Several. And do you know how many times we dismissed something because it didn't fit the data model? Silence. Whitmore nodded once. That ends now. He looked back at Annie. You reminded me that systems don't fail loudly at first. She nodded. They whisper. The manager glanced between them, uncertain how to respond. Whitmore stood taller. Arrange funding for structural updates here, he said quietly. No branding, no acquisition paperwork, just safety upgrades. Yes, sir. And set up a scholarship fund under the Brooks name, technical apprenticeships, for kids who learn differently. The manager blinked. Understood. The SUV door closed softly as he returned to make the calls. Annie walked back toward her chalk drawing. You're busy, she said. I was. Whitmore replied. She looked up again. You still are? He considered that. Yes, he admitted. But not in the same way. A breeze moved through the open garage, lifting a thin layer of dust that sparkled briefly in the sunlight. Whitmore extended his hand again, not as a businessman, but as a man making a promise. Thank you, Annie. She shook it without ceremony. You're welcome. As he turned to leave, he realized something had shifted permanently. Not his company, not his schedule, him, and sometimes that was the more difficult repair. 3 days later, the first news article appeared. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It simply asked a question. Are Whitmore Mobility's relay systems failing in high heat regions? Daniel Whitmore read the headline in silence from his office overlooking Manhattan's East River. The city moved below him with its usual confidence. Taxis weaving, ferries cutting across gray water, markets were open, analysts were awake, and somewhere in Arizona, a 6-year-old girl was probably drawing engine diagrams in chalk. He didn't panic, but he understood timing. The Denver rollout had been paused. Quietly, internally framed as performance recalibration. Investors didn't like that phrase. It sounded like retreat. His phone vibrated again. Conference call. Board members. Legal. He accepted. Daniel, one voice began carefully. We're seeing volatility in pre-market indicators. The article cites internal supplier inconsistencies. I authorized a full audit, Whitmore replied calmly. A second voice cut in. Public acknowledgement invites liability. Public denial invites collapse, he said evenly. Silence settled over the line. For years, Whit had been known as decisive, strategic, efficient, but today he sounded something else. Resolved. We address it, he continued. We correct it. We compensate if necessary. We don't bury it. One board member exhaled audibly. This could cost us 8 figures. Whitmore stared at the skyline. Integrity always does. The call ended without applause. Across the country, in a garage that still smelled faintly of cobbler and motor oil, Annie sat on an overturned bucket watching her grandfather tighten the alternator belt on his old Ford truck. Harold Hank Brooks was 68. Broad-shouldered despite age, hands thickened by decades of turning wrenches. His silver beard caught the morning light. You told him you'd fix it? Hank asked without looking up. Annie nodded. He didn't believe me. Hank grunted softly. They rarely do. She tilted her head. He came back. Hank stopped tightening and looked at her now. That so? Yes, sir. Hank studied her face carefully, the way only a grandfather could. You do good work? Yes, sir. Then that's enough. He finished tightening the belt and started the truck. It roared alive with a stubborn, satisfied growl. Annie smiled. Later that afternoon, a flatbed truck arrived at Brooks Auto Repair not to haul anything away, but to deliver something. Crates, new lift arms, updated electrical panels, industrial-grade lighting fixtures. Hank stepped out of the office slowly, wiping his hands on a faded shop rag. You Annie's grandpa? One of the contractors asked. That depends, Hank replied calmly. They handed him paperwork, funded through Whitmore Infrastructure Development. Hank read it carefully. No corporate branding, no acquisition clauses, no ownership transfer, just structural improvements. He glanced at Annie. You shake hands on this? She nodded. Yes, sir. Hank folded the paper once and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Then we'll honor it. Across state lines, Whitmore stood before a press podium. Flashes from cameras reflected off polished wood. We identified a supplier inconsistency in a limited relay batch distributed in high-temperature regions, he stated clearly. Out of precaution, we are issuing voluntary inspections and replacements at no cost. A reporter called out. Is this connected to the shutdown incident in Arizona? Whitmore paused briefly. Yes. The room stirred. Was the issue discovered internally? He hesitated only half a breath. No. Silence followed. It was brought to my attention by an independent observation. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Integrity didn't require spectacle. That evening, as desert air cooled the metal siding of Brooks Auto Repair, Hank and Annie sat on folding chairs outside the garage. The new lights had been installed. They cast a warm, steady glow across the driveway. Big man admit mistake on television, Hank said thoughtfully. Annie swung her boots. He listened. Hank nodded slowly. Most don't. She leaned her head lightly against his arm. Grandpa? Tenorang. Why don't grown-ups listen? Hank stared out toward the highway for a long moment before answering. Because listening means you might have to change. Annie considered that. Changing's not bad. No, Hank agreed quietly. It ain't. Headlights appeared in the distance. A familiar silver car slowed as it approached. Whitmore stepped out without a jacket this time. He looked tired but not weakened. Hank rose to his feet. You the one funding my electric bill? Hank asked plainly. Whitmore extended his hand respectfully. Daniel Whitmore, sir. Hank shook it firmly. Harold Brooks. Their grips held for an extra second. Not dominance. Assessment. You didn't try to buy us, Hank said. No, sir. Why? Whitmore glanced briefly at Annie. Because some places shouldn't be owned. Hank nodded once. Good answer. They stood there in shared understanding. 3 generations bridged by something simpler than contracts. Whitmore crouched down slightly toward Annie. You see the news? She shook her head. Grandpa don't like TV. Whitmore smiled faintly. We fixed it. She studied his face carefully. You listened again? Yes. She nodded once, satisfied. Good. The desert wind moved gently across the highway. Whitmore stood again. There may be pushback, he admitted to Hank. Investors. Competitors. People who preferred silence. Hank crossed his arms. Truth's louder. Whitmore absorbed that quietly. You taught her well. Hank glanced down at Annie. She was already listening. I just told her not to stop. Silence settled between them comfortably. For the first time in a long while, Whitmore felt something steadier than market confidence. He felt alignment. As he prepared to leave, Annie called out softly. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. Yes. You still building cars? Yes. Build them honest. The words were simple, but they carried weight. He nodded. I will. As he drove away under the widening desert sky, he understood something profound. Success had made him powerful, but humility had made him useful. And sometimes the greatest repairs weren't mechanical. They were moral. The backlash did not begin loudly. It began politely. An email from a long-standing investor questioning strategic transparency timing. A financial analyst suggesting Whitmore Mobility had overcorrected in its voluntary recall. A competitor's spokesperson describing the relay issue as indicative of broader instability in executive oversight. Polite words, sharp edges. Daniel Whitmore read each one carefully, never rushing his response. In another season of his life, he might have countered with aggressive messaging, redirected scrutiny, buried the issue beneath a new product announcement. But something in him had shifted in that small Arizona garage. You don't bury what whispers, Annie had said. You fix it. By the end of the week, Whitmore Mobility's stock had dipped 12%. The board requested an emergency session. The tone was different this time, less supportive. Daniel, said Martin Hale, the senior board chair. A man in his late 60s whose silver hair and measured voice carried decades of corporate victories. We appreciate integrity, but markets respond to confidence. Whitmore folded his hands on the polished conference table, and confidence built on omission doesn't last. Hale leaned back slightly. You're risking shareholder trust. Whitmore met his gaze evenly. No, I'm redefining it. Murmurs moved around the room. Another board member leaned forward. There are rumors you plan to implement a new internal review structure. One that slows production timelines. Yes, Whitmore replied calmly. Field listening audits. A faint smile touched Hale's lips. Field listening? Yes. Engineers embedded in real-world environments. Direct driver observation. Fewer simulations. More reality. A younger executive scoffed quietly. That's inefficient. Whitmore paused before answering. Efficiency without awareness is fragility. The room fell still. Hale studied him carefully. You've changed, Daniel. Whitmore considered that. Yes. Back in Phoenix, the change was quieter but just as visible. Brooks Auto Repair had new overhead lighting now. It illuminated every corner clearly without erasing the character of the place. The concrete floor had been resealed, but the original cracks remained like lines on an aging face. Hank stood beneath one of the new fixtures, examining the wiring work. They did it right, he admitted grudgingly. Annie knelt beside an old carburetor on the bench, carefully cleaning it with a cloth. You trust him? Hank asked. She didn't look up. Yes, sir. Hank nodded once. Trust's expensive. Annie paused. So is fixing what breaks. Hank let out a low chuckle. You've been thinking again. Later that afternoon, a black sedan not Whitmore's pulled into the driveway. 2 men stepped out. Suits, sunglasses, not contractors. Hank noticed immediately. Annie did too. Afternoon, Hank said evenly as they approached. One of the men offered a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Brooks, we represent Hale Strategic Holdings. Hank's expression didn't change. Never heard of it. You wouldn't have. The man replied smoothly. We're interested in ensuring community businesses remain independent. Annie watched quietly from near the garage door. We heard about Mr. Whitmore's involvement here. The second man added. We'd hate to see your shop drawn into corporate turbulence. Hank wiped his hands slowly. You threatening me? Of course not, the first man said lightly. Merely advising caution. Markets are volatile. Allegiances can be misinterpreted. Hank stepped forward half a pace. This garage has fixed trucks for 38 years. We ain't aligned with nobody but whoever needs honest work. The man's smile tightened slightly. Just be careful who you associate with. They returned to their sedan and drove off without further explanation. Annie stepped closer to her grandfather. They didn't like him telling the truth, she said quietly. Hank exhaled slowly. No. That evening, Whitmore's phone rang as he stepped out of another board session. Unknown number, he answered. Mr. Whitmore. Hank's voice came steady through the line. You make enemies telling the truth? Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. Yes. 2 of them stopped by today. Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry. Hank's tone remained even. Don't apologize. Just understand what happens when powerful folks feel embarrassed. Whitmore looked out over the city skyline again. They try to regain control. Exactly. A pause lingered between them. You still believe this is worth it? Hank asked. Whitmore thought of the press conference, the recall, the stock dip, Annie's steady voice telling him to build them honest. Yes, he said finally. Good, Hank replied. Because we ain't backing down neither. The call ended with quiet understanding. The next morning, Whitmore made another announcement not to the press, but internally. Whitmore Mobility would publish supplier transparency reports quarterly, publicly. No corporation of its size had ever volunteered that level of disclosure. By noon, financial media exploded. Radical transparency. Risky gamble. Leadership evolution or executive instability? Martin Hale called again, voice less patient this time. You're undermining investor leverage. Whitmore stood at his office window, sunlight reflecting off the river below. No, he said calmly. I'm protecting long-term trust. You're naive if you think competitors won't exploit this. Whitmore allowed himself a small, almost private smile. They already tried. Silence lingered on the other end. Hale's voice lowered slightly. This could cost you your position. Whitmore's reply came steady. Then it costs me. He ended the call. Across the country, Annie stood outside the garage watching a small desert storm gather in the distance. Dust rose in spirals beneath the darkening sky. Hank joined her. Storm coming, he said. She nodded. They always do. Wind swept across the open lot, rattling the old metal sign. Grandpa, why do storms get loud when they're scared? Hank looked down at her. Storms ain't scared. She squinted at the horizon. They sound like it. He smiled faintly. Maybe noise ain't always strength. They watched as the first gusts swept through, swirling dust across the highway. Back in Manhattan, Whitmore stood in a glass tower as headlines swirled just as fiercely. But somewhere deep beneath the noise, something steadier was forming. Not market dominance, not corporate image. Foundation, because truth didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stood its ground while everything else made noise. The vote was scheduled for Friday morning. It appeared on the internal board calendar under neutral language, Executive Leadership Review, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. Daniel Whitmore sat at the long walnut conference table, hands loosely folded, expression steady. Through the glass walls of the high-rise boardroom, Manhattan looked indifferent to corporate uncertainty. Ferries cut through the river. Traffic moved. Life continued. Across from him, Martin Hale adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate calm. We respect what you've built, Hale began, but leadership is about stability. Markets require predictability. Whitmore nodded once. And integrity. Integrity, Hale replied smoothly, is admirable. But it must be balanced with strategic discretion. The phrase lingered in the air like a veil. Strategic discretion. Silence when convenient. Hale tapped a folder in front of him. Your transparency initiative has cost the company 14% market value in under 2 weeks. Whitmore did not flinch. Temporary correction. Optimistic assumption, another board member interjected. Competitors are capitalizing on your disclosures. They're reassuring investors by doing the opposite. By hiding? Whitmore asked calmly. By managing optics. Whitmore leaned back slightly. Optics didn't prevent the relay flaw. No one answered that. Hale's voice softened. Almost paternal. Daniel, this isn't personal. But leadership sometimes requires stepping aside when vision misaligns with fiduciary responsibility. There it was, the polite language of removal. Whitmore's mind drifted unexpectedly not to financial projections, not to investor calls, but to a small garage in Arizona, to a child standing on a wooden stool, listening before acting. Engines are honest. He straightened. If this board believes transparency is misalignment, he said evenly, then perhaps the vision was flawed long before I adjusted it. A quiet ripple moved around the table. You're prepared to lose your position over this? Hale asked. Whitmore held his gaze. Yes. The room went still. In Phoenix, the desert air carried the smell of rain. Though none had fallen yet, Annie sat cross-legged near the garage entrance, carefully polishing a small brass nameplate Hank had found in an old toolbox. Brooks Auto Repair. Established. 1985. Hank leaned against the workbench, arms folded. You worried about your friend? He asked. Annie considered the question. He's not my friend. Hank raised an eyebrow. No, he's learning. Hank let out a low chuckle. That so? She nodded. He listens now. Hank studied her thoughtfully. Listening makes enemies sometimes. Annie looked up at him. So does lying. The words were simple, not dramatic, just true. Hank nodded slowly. That's right. Back in Manhattan, the board's legal counsel slid a document across the table. Voluntary resignation preserves your reputation, he said carefully. A formal removal would create narrative complications. Whitmore glanced at the paper but did not touch it. What happens if I don't sign? Hale answered quietly. We proceed with a vote. And if the vote removes me, you walk away with severance. Whitmore allowed a small, almost tired smile. You misunderstand. Hale frowned slightly. I'm not negotiating compensation. He stood slowly. I'm protecting direction. He looked around the table at men and women who had once applauded his risk-taking. You hired me because I built something disruptive, he continued. Now you want something comfortable. Comfortable is stable, someone replied. No, Whitmore said softly. Comfortable is fragile. Silence. He placed his palms lightly on the table. If you remove me, Whitmore mobility will revert to managed perception. Short-term reassurance. Long-term erosion. Hale's jaw tightened. You presume too much. Whitmore met his eyes evenly. I built it. The tension in the room thickened. In Arizona, a dusty pickup truck pulled into Brooks Auto Repair. A regular customer, Mrs. Alvarez, late 60s, widow, loyal to Hank for decades. My steering's pulling again, she called warmly. Hank stepped forward immediately. We'll take care of it. Annie followed close behind, watching as Hank crouched near the front wheel. See that? He said quietly to her. Uneven wear. She nodded. Caused by what? Alignment's off. He smiled faintly. Exactly. He stood and glanced at the horizon. Sometimes things pull in the wrong direction, gradual-like, he added. If you ignore it long enough, it'll cost you more than tires. Annie understood. Back in Manhattan, the vote began. One by one, hands were raised. The tally was closer than Hale had expected. Too close. When it ended, the result was narrow. Whitmore remained CEO, but barely. Hale closed his folder slowly. This is not a victory, he said quietly. Whitmore nodded. I know. The board dispersed with measured restraint. Whitmore remained alone in the room for several moments. He understood something clearly now. The external battle was not the most dangerous one. The internal fracture was. He picked up his phone and scrolled to a number saved simply as Hank. He hesitated, then called. Hank answered on the third ring. You win or lose? Hank asked without greeting. Whitmore exhaled softly. Stayed. Hank grunted approvingly. Good. It was close. Worth it? Whitmore looked out at the skyline again. Yes. A pause. You understand this ain't over? Hank said. Yes. Storms circle back. Whitmore thought of Annie's words. They whisper first. I'll be ready, he replied. He ended the call and stood quietly. For the first time in years, leadership did not feel like authority. It felt like endurance. And endurance required something stronger than strategy. It required conviction. Far away, under a warm desert sky, Annie wiped her hands on an old shop rag and looked at the highway, stretching endlessly into dusk. She didn't understand stock prices. She didn't understand board votes, but she understood alignment. And somewhere between $1 billion boardroom and a cracked concrete garage floor, something unseen was shifting, not just in a company, in a man. The public test came on a Tuesday morning, not through a hostile board vote, not through an investor lawsuit, not even through a competitor's press release. It came through a live broadcast. Whitmore Mobility's annual Innovation Summit had been scheduled months in advance, an event streamed globally, where new prototypes were unveiled and bold projections were announced under sweeping lights and orchestral soundtracks. This year, however, the tone was different. Daniel Whitmore stood backstage in San Francisco, listening to the low roar of thousands of attendees filling the convention hall. Investors, engineers, journalists, industry critics, waiting for weakness. On the teleprompter in front of him was the original speech draft. It promised acceleration, expansion, aggressive growth targets. It did not mention recalls. It did not mention transparency. It did not mention listening. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he reached forward and turned it off. Across the country, Brooks Auto Repair was unusually busy. Word had spread not about corporate drama, but about something simpler. Whitmore had publicly credited a small independent garage in Arizona for influencing operational reforms. He hadn't named Annie. He hadn't exploited the story. But people had connected dots. A local radio host had mentioned it, then a regional news station, then a national business segment. Now curious drivers were stopping by not for spectacle, but for honesty. Hank stood beneath the upgraded lights, steady as ever, tightening bolts on a delivery van. "We're not a museum," he muttered when a camera crew approached politely. "We understand," the reporter replied gently. "We're here because something rare happened. A corporation admitted it learned from you." Hank wiped his hands and nodded toward Annie, who was quietly organizing socket wrenches by size. "Learned from her," he corrected. Annie didn't look up. Back in San Francisco, the stage lights brightened. Whitmore stepped into view. Applause filled the hall, automatically habitual, corporate, practiced. He stood at the podium without notes. "For years," he began calmly, "we've defined innovation as speed." The audience settled. Faster production, faster rollout, faster market capture. He paused. "But recently, I was reminded that speed without awareness is simply motion." A few heads tilted. In Arizona, during what should have been a routine shutdown event, someone listened to our system more carefully than we did. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't sentimentalize it. She reminded me that machines whisper before they fail. Silence fell across the massive hall. And so do organizations. The investors in the front rows shifted slightly. "We have spent the past month correcting a supplier flaw," he continued. "But more importantly, we've begun correcting a culture flaw." Now the room was completely still. We prioritized optics over observation, growth over grounding, data over direct experience. A journalist lowered her camera slightly. "That changes now." He stepped away from the podium, walking slowly across the stage. "Today, Whitmore Mobility is launching a new initiative, the Listening Lab." The massive screen behind him illuminated not with product renderings but with footage of engineers in real-world environments. Desert highways, snow-covered roads, small-town repair shops. "We will embed engineers in communities. We will audit supplier processes publicly, and we will fund independent technical education programs across underserved regions." A ripple of surprise moved through the hall. "This is not charity," Whitmore said evenly. "It is correction." Somewhere in the back, a small group began clapping. It wasn't loud, but it was real. In Phoenix, the television in Hank's small office crackled with the live broadcast. Mrs. Alvarez stood beside Annie, watching quietly. "He sounds different," she said. Annie nodded. "He is." On stage, Whitmore concluded calmly, "You can build a powerful machine, but if you don't build it honestly, it will eventually turn against you." The applause this time was slower but heavier. Not enthusiasm, respect. Back in Manhattan, Martin Hale watched from his office screen. His expression was unreadable. One of his advisors stepped closer. "This is risky," the advisor murmured. Hale nodded faintly. "Yes. Stock will react." "Yes." They both watched as the camera briefly showed footage of a modest Arizona garage beneath desert light. No branding, no ownership claim, just acknowledgement. Hale exhaled slowly. "He's changing the narrative," he admitted. The advisor hesitated. And if the market responds positively? Hale didn't answer immediately. Then perhaps, he said carefully, we misjudged the appetite for integrity. That afternoon, markets fluctuated wildly. By closing bell, Whitmore Mobility stock had recovered 6%, not fully restored, but stabilizing. More importantly, social commentary shifted tone, corporate accountability model, transparency as competitive edge, leadership evolution in real time. Not all praise, not all criticism, but balance. That evening, Whitmore stood alone on the rooftop terrace outside his hotel. San Francisco's skyline glowed beneath a soft coastal haze. His phone buzzed. Hank, you embarrassed some powerful folks today, Hank said plainly. Whitmore allowed a faint smile. Probably. Worth it. Whitmore looked out across the water. Yes. A pause. She watched, Hank added. Whitmore felt something steady settle in his chest. Tell her thank you. You tell her yourself, Hank replied. The line clicked, and a moment later Annie's small voice came through. Mr. Whitmore? Yes. You built them honest. He swallowed lightly. I'm trying. She considered that. That's how it starts. Wind moved across the rooftop, cool and steady. Annie, he said quietly. Do you know what courage is? She thought for a moment, fixing it even when it's hard. He smiled to himself. That's right. When the call ended, Whitmore remained standing beneath the open sky. The storm hadn't passed completely. Board tensions remained. Competitors were circling. Market pressures would return. But something fundamental had shifted. The test had been public, and he had not stepped back. In a small garage miles away, Annie turned off the office television and walked back to the workbench, organizing tools one by one. Outside, the desert sky deepened into violet. Storms might circle back, but foundations, once reinforced, did not tremble so easily. Chapter 9. The resignation letter was handwritten. Daniel Whitmore had drafted it digitally twice, revised it 3 times, and deleted it entirely before finally reaching for a pen. There was something about ink on paper that felt irreversible. Honest. Like signing your name to something that couldn't be edited once sent. He didn't resign as CEO. He resigned as chairman of the board. The position had been largely ceremonial after the recent vote symbolic authority layered on top of operational leadership. But symbolism mattered in corporate warfare. By stepping down from the chairmanship, he removed the board's argument that he was consolidating too much influence. He reduced their leverage. He made his position about responsibility, not control. When he entered the boardroom that Friday morning, the mood was restrained. Martin Hale looked up as Whitmore placed the envelope on the polished table. What's this? Hale asked. A correction, Whitmore replied calmly. Hale opened it slowly, scanning the page. You're relinquishing chair authority. Yes. The other members exchanged glances. This doesn't weaken you? One asked carefully. Whitmore shook his head. It clarifies me. Hale leaned back in his chair. You understand stepping down from chairman limits your strategic insulation. Yes. You'll be exposed to shareholder pressure directly. Yes. And you're comfortable with that? Whitmore met his gaze evenly. I've learned something recently. If you build honestly, insulation becomes unnecessary. Silence settled over the room. It wasn't defeat they saw in him. It was resolve, without ego. Hale folded the letter once and set it down. This changes the tone, he admitted quietly. That's the point. Across the country, Brooks Auto Repair was adjusting to its new rhythm. The novelty had worn off. News vans had left. Curious onlookers had dwindled. What remained were regular customers and steady work, which was exactly how Hank preferred it. Annie stood on a stool beside him, watching as he reassembled a transmission housing. You ever give something up on purpose? She asked. Hank didn't look up. Plenty. Why? Because sometimes holding tight makes it worse. She considered that. Like over-tightening a bolt? He smiled faintly. Exactly like that. Meanwhile, back in New York, Whitmore's decision sent subtle tremors through financial media. Whitmore steps down as chairman's strategic retreat or power realignment. CEO CD's board control amid transparency push. Analysts debated motives. Was he cornered? Was he weakened? Was he positioning himself as a martyr? Few considered the simplest possibility, that he meant it. By Monday, the market response was unexpectedly stable. Investors interpreted the move as governance balance rather than instability. The stock held. But something else happened quietly that week. 3 mid-level executives submitted resignations, not in protest. In refusal, they disagreed with the new transparency protocols. They had built careers on managed narratives and strategic opacity. The Listening Lab initiative threatened their methods. Whitmore read each resignation carefully. No anger, no retaliation, just acknowledgement. Culture shifts always cost something. That afternoon, he received a call from an unexpected number. Mrs. Alvarez. Hank had apparently given her his office line. Mr. Whitmore? Her voice asked gently. Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to say. My nephew works for your company in Denver. He said the new inspections found something before it caused trouble. Whitmore felt a quiet warmth settle in his chest. I'm glad. He said nobody got blamed. They just fixed it. That's the goal. She paused. Thank you for not pretending. The line clicked softly when she hung up. Whitmore sat back in his chair. That single call meant more than analyst commentary. In Phoenix, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the garage floor. Annie sat cross-legged near the entrance, drawing again in chalk. This time, she wasn't sketching gears. She was drawing two houses connected by a long road. Hank stepped closer. What's that? New York and here. He nodded. Long road. Yes. She added small dots along the road. What are those? Fixes. He studied the drawing quietly. You think he'll stay strong? Annie didn't hesitate. He already gave something up. Hank crossed his arms. That matters? Yes. She looked up at him. People who give up power on purpose don't scare easy. Hank let out a slow breath. Hope you're right. Back in Manhattan, Whitmore stood alone in the now quiet boardroom late one evening. Without the chairman's title, the room felt different, less like a throne, more like a workspace. He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights flickering beneath him. For years, leadership had meant ascent, higher floors, bigger offices, greater insulation. Now it felt like exposure, accountability without buffer. He found he preferred it. His phone vibrated softly. A simple text message from Hank. She says storms respect houses that stand straight. Whitmore smiled faintly. He typed back, I'm learning to build straighter. Across the country, Annie finished her chalk drawing and stood up, brushing dust from her hands. The desert wind moved gently through the open garage door. No cameras, no headlines, no board votes, just steady air and honest work. The sacrifice Whitmore had made wasn't dramatic enough for primetime coverage, but it shifted something fundamental. He had given up status to protect direction, and in doing so, he had made it harder for anyone to claim he was protecting ego. Storms would return. Competitors would probe. The board would test him again. But something was different now. The foundation wasn't built on authority. It was built on alignment. And alignment, once secured, did not shake easily. The confrontation did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in a private dining room overlooking Lake Michigan. Martin Hale had requested the meeting personally. No assistants, no legal counsel, just the two of them. Daniel Whitmore arrived 5 minutes early. The restaurant was quiet at that hour, the lunch crowd not yet seated. Sunlight reflected off the water beyond the glass, calm but deceptive in its depth. Hale was already there, silver hair immaculate, posture controlled. You've lost weight, Hale observed as Whitmore sat down. Less insulation, Whitmore replied calmly. A faint smile flickered across Hale's face, still deflecting with philosophy. I'm past deflection. Menus were placed before them, but neither man opened one. Hale folded his hands. You understand why I asked for this? Whitmore nodded. Because the vote wasn't decisive enough. Hale did not deny it. There's division, Daniel. The board is split. Some believe you've positioned yourself as morally untouchable. Whitmore raised an eyebrow slightly. Untouchable? You've made opposition appear unethical. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. I haven't labeled anyone unethical. You didn't have to, Hale said evenly. Your narrative did. Outside, a small sailboat cut slowly across the lake. Whitmore chose his words carefully. If telling the truth pressures people, that pressure isn't manipulation. It's exposure. Hale studied him for a long moment. You're forcing the board into a corner. No, Whitmore said quietly. I stepped out of the corner when I resigned the chairmanship. Silence lingered between them. Hale exhaled slowly. There's an acquisition proposal. Whitmore's gaze sharpened slightly. For us? He asked. No, for Brooks Auto Repair. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Whitmore did not move immediately. From whom? An affiliate group connected to one of our larger competitors, disguised as community development. Whitmore's jaw tightened just slightly. And the board's position? Hale's eyes held steady. Some members believe acquiring the garage eliminates symbolic leverage. Whitmore leaned forward slowly. They want to buy the place that exposed the flaw. They want to control the narrative. Whitmore's voice remained calm but lower. That garage is not an asset. It's influence, Hale replied. Whitmore stood abruptly, then stopped himself, sitting back down. You said this wasn't personal, he said. It isn't, Hale answered. It's strategic containment. Whitmore's thoughts moved quickly, not toward market impact, not toward optics, but toward a chalk drawing on concrete. Toward a small girl who believed promises mattered more than money. They won't sell, he said evenly. Hale's gaze shifted slightly. You're certain? Yes. You don't control that decision. Whitmore's voice was steady. No. But I know them. Across the country, the offer arrived in an envelope thicker than necessary. Hank opened it at the workbench, Annie standing beside him. He read silently, expression unreadable. What's it say? Annie asked. They want to buy the property, renovate it, rebrand it as a mobility innovation satellite. Annie blinked. What's that? Fancy way of saying it won't be ours anymore. She looked at the walls, the floor, the old sign. How much? Hank let out a low whistle. Enough to retire twice. Annie considered that. Do you want to? Hank folded the paper carefully. No. She nodded once, satisfied. Later that afternoon, the black sedan returned. Different men this time. Polished smiles, polite tones. We believe this could secure your family's future, one said smoothly. Hank listened without interrupting. And in exchange? He asked. Full property transfer, brand integration, public endorsement of our initiative. Annie stepped closer to her grandfather. Hank rested a hand gently on her shoulder. You know why we fix cars? He asked the men calmly. They exchanged brief glances. Because people need reliable transportation, one answered carefully. No, Hank said quietly. Because engines deserve honesty. The men blinked. This isn't emotional, the other added. It's opportunity. Hank nodded slowly. Opportunity ain't always improvement. Annie looked up at him. Grandpa. Tell them no. He smiled faintly. Already did. The men's expressions cooled slightly. You may regret this, one said. Hank's eyes didn't waver. Not likely. They left without shaking hands. Back in Chicago, Hale studied Whitmore carefully. They refused, Hale said finally. Whitmore didn't smile. I told you. Hale leaned back in his chair. You realize this strengthens your position. Whitmore shook his head. It strengthens nothing. It weakens the opposition. It proves something simpler, Whitmore said quietly. Integrity isn't for sale. Hale's gaze lingered on him. You're forcing the board to choose. No, Whitmore replied. I'm forcing them to reveal. The waiter approached, hesitant. Gentlemen, are we ready to order? Hale closed his menu without looking at it. Black coffee? Whitmore nodded. The same. When the waiter left, Hale spoke again, voice lower. If this escalates, there will be a formal challenge. Whitmore met his eyes evenly. Then we'll face it. Outside, the lake remained calm, but beneath its surface, currents moved steadily. In Phoenix, Annie sat on the hood of Hank's old truck, watching the sun sink behind distant mountains. You think they'll come back? She asked. Yes, Hank replied. You scared? He considered the question. No. Why? Because we ain't hiding nothing. She leaned her head against his arm. Neither is he. Hank nodded. That's why they're nervous. As night settled over the desert and over the city skyline miles away, the lines were clearer than before. This was no longer about a faulty relay, or stock fluctuation, or public relations. It was about control. And control does not yield quietly when challenged by truth. The next move would not be subtle. It would be direct. Chapter 11. The formal challenge arrived in the form of a letter marked Special Session Notice. It was delivered not by email, not through internal channels, but by courier-heavy paper, embossed seal, the kind of symbolism meant to communicate seriousness. Daniel Whitmore read it alone in his office. A shareholder coalition, led quietly by Martin Hale's allies, was invoking a governance clause. A vote of no confidence in the CEO's leadership direction. Not misconduct, not financial fraud, not negligence. Direction. He exhaled slowly and folded the letter once. Outside his window, Manhattan moved as always, unaware that power structures were shifting several floors above. He picked up his phone and called Hank. You hear the storm yet? Hank asked before Whitmore could speak. Yes, Whitmore replied calmly. It's official. They going public? Yes. Hank was silent for a moment. You steady? Yes. You sure? Whitmore glanced at the skyline. I am. In Phoenix, Annie stood at the edge of the garage driveway, watching heat shimmer off the asphalt. News vans had returned not for celebration this time, but for conflict. Corporate power struggle at Whitmore Mobility. CEO faces removal vote amid transparency reforms. A local reporter approached carefully. Mr. Brooks, do you believe your garage is connected to this corporate dispute? Hank wiped his hands on a cloth and answered evenly. This garage fixes cars. But Mr. Whitmore has cited you as inspiration for major reforms. Hank nodded once. Then I hope he keeps fixing what's broken. The reporter glanced toward Annie. And you? Annie blinked up at the camera. Engines whisper first, she said simply. The clip aired nationally within hours. Back in New York, Whitmore watched it without expression. Then he turned off the screen. The special session was scheduled for the following Thursday. Shareholders would vote on retaining or removing him as CEO. Public. Transparent. No quiet maneuvering. Martin Hale requested one final private conversation before the vote. They met this time not in a restaurant, but in the boardroom itself. No lake view. No polished dining silver. Just the long walnut table and the city beyond the glass. You could avoid this. Hale began quietly. Step down voluntarily. Preserve dignity. Shape succession. Whitmore stood near the window, hands loosely clasped behind his back. And the reforms? They can continue under moderated pace. Whitmore turned. Moderated transparency isn't transparency. Hale's patience thinned slightly. You're risking the company. No, Whitmore replied evenly. I'm risking my position. There's a difference. Yes, Whitmore agreed. That's the point. Hale studied him. You've become symbolic, Daniel. That's dangerous. Whitmore allowed a faint smile. Symbolism only threatens people who depend on illusion. The air in the room tightened. You believe you're morally superior. Whitmore shook his head slowly. No. I believe we were wrong. And I chose to correct it. Silence. You built this company, Hale said after a long pause. But it doesn't belong to you. Whitmore nodded. I know. Then why fight so hard? Whitmore thought of a cracked concrete floor in Arizona. Of chalk drawings. Of a 6-year-old refusing to sell something honest for comfort. Because if I walk away now, he said quietly, they'll call transparency a mistake. Hale's gaze lingered. And if shareholders remove you? Whitmore met his eyes steadily. Then they choose. The vote day arrived under gray skies. Financial media gathered outside headquarters before sunrise. Analysts speculated live on air. Social feeds buzzed. In Phoenix, Hank set up an old portable radio on the workbench. Annie sat cross-legged nearby, silent. You nervous? Hank asked. She shook her head. No. Why not? He did the hard part already. Hank considered that. What was that? Telling the truth when it cost him. Back in Manhattan, the shareholder meeting began precisely at 10 a.m. Whitmore stood at the podium. No teleprompter. I will not argue for my character, he began calmly. Only for direction. He outlined the listening lab results. Reduced defect rates. Improved supplier accountability. Customer satisfaction metrics rising in previously volatile regions. This isn't idealism, he continued. It's structural correction. One shareholder rose from the floor. Your reforms triggered volatility. Yes, Whitmore replied evenly. Because we exposed fragility. Another voice followed. You embarrassed the board. Whitmore did not flinch. I embarrassed complacency. Murmurs rippled across the hall. The vote commenced electronically. Minutes stretched long. In Phoenix, static crackled from the radio. Hank stood still. Annie closed her eyes briefly. Back in Manhattan, the final tally appeared on the large screen behind the podium. Retain CEO, 58%. Remove CEO, 42%. A clear margin, not overwhelming, but decisive. Whitmore exhaled slowly. Applause began not thunderous, but grounded. Martin Hale remained seated. When the room cleared, Hale approached Whitmore one last time. You survived, Hale said quietly. Whitmore shook his head slightly. No. Hale raised an eyebrow. No? Whitmore looked around the emptying hall. We shifted. Hale studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. This isn't over, he said. Whitmore accepted the handshake. It never is. In Phoenix, the radio announcer confirmed the result. Annie opened her eyes. Told you, she said softly. Hank let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Yeah, he admitted. You did. That evening, Whitmore's phone rang. He didn't need to check the caller ID. You stayed, Annie said when he answered. Yes. You happy? Whitmore considered the question carefully. I'm steady. She seemed to approve of that answer. That's better. As desert twilight settled over Brooks Auto Repair and city lights flickered on across Manhattan, something fundamental had been tested. Not business acumen, not market strength, conviction. And conviction, once proven under pressure, carries weight no board vote can erase. But storms rarely end with a single wave. The opposition had lost publicly. That made them more dangerous privately. Retaliation did not come in headlines. It came in silence. 2 weeks after the shareholder vote, Whitmore Mobility's internal audit system flagged an anomaly small at first glance, buried in regional logistics reporting. A shipment delay, then another, then a pattern. Daniel Whitmore stared at the data in his office late one evening. The numbers weren't catastrophic. They were subtle. Margins tightening. Supplier errors increasing in one specific region. Phoenix. His jaw tightened slightly. He dialed the operations director. Why are Phoenix deliveries lagging? A pause on the other end. We've had some routing complications, the director replied carefully. What kind of complications? Warehouse reassignment. Temporary staffing gaps. Whitmore's voice stayed calm. Who authorized the reassignment? Another pause. It came through an internal directive from procurement oversight. Whitmore ended the call without comment. Procurement oversight reported to a board subcommittee one Martin Hale had chaired for years. In Phoenix, Hank noticed the change before anyone announced it. Parts orders that normally arrived within 48 hours were taking 5 days. 2 loyal customers had called to ask if the garage was transitioning. Transitioning to what? Hank asked one caller. Some new regional partner. Got a flyer in the mail. Hank frowned. There had been no conversation. That afternoon, a glossy brochure arrived in their mailbox. Whitmore Mobility Authorized, Service Network, Modernized, Certified, Corporate-backed. The address listed for the new Phoenix service hub was only 6 miles away. Annie stood beside Hank as he read it. They're building a shiny one, she said. Hank nodded slowly. Looks like. Are we shiny? She asked. He looked around at the worn concrete, the oil-stained workbench, the American flag gently stirring near the fan. No, he answered. Good, she replied. That evening, Whitmore called Hank directly. They're squeezing you, Whitmore said plainly. Hank didn't deny it. Feels like it. They're diverting supply priority to the new corporate hub. Why? Whitmore exhaled. Because they can't remove me publicly anymore. So they'll try to weaken what strengthened me. Silence stretched across the line. You want me to fight? Hank asked. Whitmore considered carefully. No. You sure? Yes. Keep doing what you're doing. That enough? Whitmore's voice softened slightly. It has been so far. The corporate service hub opened with banners and catered food. News outlets covered it as an expansion success story. Modern glass frontage. Uniformed technicians. Complimentary espresso. Customers were offered promotional discounts for switching from independent service providers. The message wasn't explicit, but it was clear. In the weeks that followed, Brooks Auto Repair saw a slight dip in new inquiries. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. Annie watched quietly. One afternoon, she stood near the open bay as a longtime customer, Mrs. Alvarez, pulled in. They offered me a free inspection over there, Mrs. Alvarez admitted gently as she stepped out of her car. You going? Annie asked. Mrs. Alvarez looked at Hank. I thought about it. Hank wiped his hands calmly. No hard feelings if you do. Mrs. Alvarez studied him. You'd let me? Course. She looked toward the sleek building visible in the distance, then back at the familiar garage. I don't need espresso, she said firmly. I need someone who tells me the truth. She handed Hank her keys. Across town, the corporate hub manager filed weekly performance reports. Initial customer traffic, strong. Conversion rate, moderate. Local resistance, unexpected. In Manhattan, Whitmore received both sets of reports. He didn't intervene immediately. He watched. Sabotage through competition required one thing. Fear. And fear required insecurity. 3 weeks into the rollout, a different anomaly appeared in the system. Customer satisfaction surveys from the new hub showed a pattern. Efficient. Professional. Impersonal. One comment stood out. They replaced parts that didn't need replacing. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. There it was. Pressure to outperform had created shortcuts. He scheduled an unannounced visit. The corporate hub buzzed with clean efficiency when he arrived. The manager nearly froze upon seeing him. Sir, this is unexpected. That's the point, Whitmore replied calmly. He walked through each bay slowly, watched technicians interact, listened. At one station, he observed a mechanic recommending a full assembly replacement for a minor calibration issue. Whitmore stepped closer. Why full replacement? The technician hesitated. It's faster. For whom? Whitmore asked quietly. The room grew still. Later that evening, he requested internal audit on the Phoenix hub. Not public. Not dramatic. Precise. Back at Brooks Auto Repair, Annie sat on the hood of Hank's truck again, watching dusk settle. You think they'll stop? She asked. No, Hank answered honestly. Why? Because pride don't like being corrected. Annie nodded thoughtfully. But truth doesn't like being buried. Hank smiled faintly. No, it don't. In Manhattan, preliminary audit findings confirmed what Whitmore suspected. Overservicing, inflated part replacements, performance metrics prioritized over necessity. Nothing illegal, but ethically compromised. He forwarded the report directly to the board. No commentary, just data. Martin Hale called him within the hour. You're escalating, Hale said coolly. Whitmore's tone remained even. I'm correcting. You're humiliating regional leadership. I'm protecting customers. Silence. This ends one way, Hale said finally. Yes, Whitmore replied calmly. With alignment. In Phoenix, word spread quietly. A few customers who had tried the corporate hub returned. They fixed things that weren't broken. One man muttered. Hank didn't gloat. He simply nodded. Annie leaned toward him and whispered, Engines whisper first. Hank squeezed her shoulder gently. Across cities and boardrooms, something subtle was happening. The retaliation had exposed motive. And motive, once exposed, weakened its own strategy. The opposition had tried to undermine through pressure. Instead, they revealed impatience. But impatience under scrutiny rarely retreats quietly. The next move would not target business. It would target reputation. The attack began on a Tuesday morning. Not with shouting. Not with lawsuits. With an article. Whitmore's Arizona influence. Ethical reform or strategic exploitation? Daniel Whitmore read the headline without blinking. The piece did not accuse him of fraud. It did not question financial performance. It questioned motive. According to unnamed sources, Whitmore had leveraged a small, minority-owned repair shop in Phoenix for personal brand rehabilitation. The article suggested emotional manipulation, optics over authenticity. A billionaire, using a child's story to shield himself from governance, accountability. The phrasing was careful, not defamatory, just corrosive. By noon, financial commentators were discussing it. Is Whitmore weaponizing sentiment? Has the Phoenix garage become a PR asset? Whitmore closed his office door and sat down slowly. He had expected retaliation. He had not expected it aimed there. His phone vibrated. Hank, you seen it? Hank asked quietly. Yes. Silence on the line. They callin' us pawns, Hank said. Whitmore's voice remained steady. You're not. I know that, Hank replied. But the world don't. In Phoenix, a different kind of van returned to the curb outside Brooks Auto Repair. Not a business reporter this time. Investigative press. A young woman approached the garage with a recorder in hand. Mr. Brooks, do you believe Mr. Whitmore is using your family to protect his image? Hank didn't answer immediately. Annie stood near the doorway, listening. We fix cars, Hank said evenly. But do you receive financial backing from Whitmore Mobility? Hank glanced at Annie briefly before answering. He invested in improving our equipment, openly, publicly, with contracts. So you are financially tied? Yes, Hank replied. Doesn't make us puppets. The reporter shifted her focus. Annie, she said gently, kneeling slightly. Do you feel pressured to speak kindly about Mr. Whitmore? Annie studied her carefully. No. Why not? Because nobody tells me what to say. The reporter hesitated. Do you think he needs you? Annie considered the question in full seriousness. No, she answered finally. But he listens. The clip circulated online within hours. Some praised her composure. Others questioned whether a child could truly understand corporate influence. In Manhattan, Martin Hale stood in Whitmore's office, uninvited. You underestimated the optics, Hale said coolly. Whitmore did not rise from his chair. I didn't create the optics. You participated in them. I participated in correction. Hale's eyes sharpened. You let yourself become a symbol. Whitmore's voice lowered slightly. No. I let myself become visible. Hale stepped closer. The board won't defend you if this narrative hardens. Whitmore met his gaze evenly. Then they shouldn't. Hale paused. You'd risk removal again? Yes. For a garage? Whitmore stood now. For integrity. Hale searched his face for hesitation. He found none. In Phoenix, the tone shifted subtly over the next few days. Online commentary grew sharper. Of course, the billionaire funds the small shop. Strategic charity. Image laundering. Hank turned off the computer after reading too many comments. Annie sat beside him quietly. You mad? She asked. No. You hurt? He considered that carefully. Maybe a little. She nodded. Grandpa? Truth don't get louder when people shout. He looked down at her. Where'd you hear that? You. Hank smiled faintly. Across the country. Whitmore scheduled a press conference. Not flashy. Not defensive. Transparent. Reporters gathered in the company auditorium. Whitmore stepped to the podium without notes. I've been accused of using a family in Phoenix to rehabilitate my image, he began calmly. Cameras clicked. I want to clarify something. He paused deliberately. I did not help Brooks Auto Repair to protect my position. He let the silence sit. I helped them because they were right. A murmur rippled across the room. I did not ask for endorsements. I did not script interviews. And I did not expect their story to become symbolic. He looked directly into the cameras. But if integrity becomes symbolic, that says more about the environment than the act. A reporter raised her hand. Did your investment influence their public support? Whitmore shook his head. No. Can you prove that? Whitmore's expression did not change. I don't need to. Another voice followed. Why not divest to eliminate perception of conflict? Whitmore answered evenly. Because that would confirm the accusation. Silence. He stepped back from the podium. I will not withdraw support from honest people to satisfy cynical narratives. He left without taking further questions. In Phoenix, Hank listened to the replay on the radio. Annie stood very still. He didn't leave, she whispered. No. Hank agreed softly. He didn't. Later that evening, Whitmore's phone rang again. This time it wasn't Hank. It was one of the independent board members who had voted against him during the no-confidence session. I misjudged you, the man said quietly. Whitmore didn't respond immediately. You could have distanced yourself. Yes. You didn't. No. A pause. The board will meet tomorrow. Whitmore understood what that meant. Alignment was shifting again. In the desert, twilight settled gently over the garage. No cameras. No interviews. Just routine work. Annie drew another chalk picture near the entrance. This one showed a tall building and a small garage side by side. Above them, she drew the same sun. Hank leaned over. What's that mean? Light hits both, she said simply. Across cities and power structures, perception had been weaponized. But perception, when confronted directly, often fractures under scrutiny. The attack on reputation had failed to provoke retreat. Instead, it clarified position. Still, those who lose narrative control rarely surrender entirely. When public doubt doesn't break a leader, private leverage becomes the next tool. The letter arrived by certified mail. Not to Whitmore Mobility headquarters, not to Daniel Whitmore's Manhattan office, but to Brooks Auto Repair in Phoenix, Arizona. Hank signed for it with grease still on his fingers. The envelope was thick, embossed with the name of a national law firm, whose reputation alone could intimidate small businesses into compliance. Annie watched quietly as Hank opened it at the workbench. He read the first page slowly, then the second. His jaw did not tighten, his shoulders did not stiffen, but something in the room shifted. What is it? Annie asked softly. Hank folded the letter once before answering. They're claiming trademark confusion. She blinked. What's that? They say our sign Brooks Auto Repair and Custom Services sounds too close to their new Whitmore Certified Service Network. Annie frowned. That don't even sound the same. Hank gave a faint nod. Don't matter. They're saying customers might think we're pretending to be official. Are we? No. She crossed her arms. So why they say that? Hank met her eyes. Because it costs them little to send paper. Costs us a lot to answer it. The letter demanded immediate rebranding. Removal of any implied association with Whitmore Mobility, and public clarification that Brooks Auto Repair was not an authorized corporate affiliate despite their open investment partnership. Failure to comply, it warned, could result in litigation for damages and brand dilution. Annie looked at the old wooden sign hanging above the garage door. The paint was chipped, the letters uneven. Her grandmother had hand-lettered it 30 years ago. They want us to take it down? She asked. Hank nodded once. The desert air felt heavier that afternoon. He dialed Whitmore. Daniel answered on the second ring. They sent it. Hank said simply. I know, Whitmore replied. There was no surprise in his voice, They CC'd corporate counsel. Silence stretched for a moment. You involved? Hank asked. No. Hank believed him. They're trying to sever visible ties, Whitmore continued. If they can isolate you, they weaken me. Annie stepped closer, listening. What do we do? Hank asked. Whitmore's answer came without hesitation. You don't take the sign down. Hank exhaled slowly. You understand the cost? Yes. And if we lose? Whitmore's voice softened, but did not waver. You won't. In Manhattan, Whitmore walked into the legal department unannounced. He placed a copy of the letter on the conference table. Who authorized this? He asked calmly. No one answered immediately. Finally, a senior counsel spoke. It originated from external brand advisory. Under whose direction? Another pause. Board liaison committee. Whitmore nodded once. Withdraw it. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Sir, that may appear as admission. Withdraw it, he repeated evenly. Hours later, Martin Hale stood once again in Whitmore's office. You're overstepping, Hale said. Whitmore remained seated. No, I'm correcting. The letter was a protective measure. It was intimidation. It was legal positioning. It was leverage against a family. Whitmore replied quietly. Hale's expression cooled. You're emotional. Whitmore stood now. No, I'm aligned. The two men held each other's gaze. You can't shield them forever, Hale said. Whitmore's voice lowered. I don't need to. In Phoenix, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mrs. Alvarez brought over homemade empanadas. Mr. Thompson, from 2 streets over, offered to repaint the sign if needed. Danny Rodriguez, a retired mechanic who had known Hank for decades, showed up without being asked. They suing you? Danny asked bluntly. Trying, Hank replied. Danny spat lightly into the dust. Over a sign? Over control. That evening, the local community center hosted an impromptu gathering. Not a protest, not a rally, just neighbors. Annie sat beside her grandmother, listening as people spoke one by one. They fixed my truck when I couldn't afford it. They stayed late when my daughter's car broke down. They tell the truth. No speeches. No slogans. Just testimony. Hank stood at the front, hat in his hands. We ain't looking for a fight, he said calmly. But we ain't taking down that sign. Applause filled the modest room. Across the country, Whitmore received a scanned photo of the gathering. He studied it quietly. Ordinary folding chairs, fluorescent lights, unpolished loyalty. He forwarded the image to the board with one line. This is what you attempted to pressure. By morning, the legal letter was formally withdrawn. No public apology. No admission. Just a quiet notice that the claim had been reevaluated. In Phoenix, Annie stood beneath the old wooden sign and looked up at it. They blinked, she said. Hank smiled faintly. Looks that way. Why? Because some fights cost more than they're worth. She thought about that carefully. Or because truth don't scare easy. Hank rested a hand gently on her shoulder. Maybe both. In Manhattan, Martin Hale sat alone in the boardroom long after others had left. The legal maneuver had failed. The acquisition attempt had failed. The reputation attack had failed. Each escalation had only strengthened Whitmore's public footing. Hale understood something now. This was no longer about removing a CEO. It was about redefining control. And control, when threatened repeatedly, eventually chooses its final card. Not pressure, not persuasion, exposure. The next move would not target business. It would not target reputation. It would target the past. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Not in Phoenix. Not even in Manhattan. It surfaced on a financial blog based out of Chicago. The kind of outlet that specialized in corporate transparency and anonymous leaks. The headline was clinical, almost polite. Whitmore Mobility CEO's early venture tied to controversial plant closure. By noon, it was everywhere. Daniel Whitmore sat in his office, the skyline behind him blurred by late autumn rain. As his communications director read aloud from a tablet, they're referencing Ridgeway Components, Ohio, 22 years ago, claiming you were on the advisory board when the plant was shut down. Whitmore did not interrupt. They're implying you supported outsourcing that eliminated 600 jobs. Silence lingered after she finished. Did you? She asked quietly. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. Yes, he said. The word did not shake, but it carried weight. In Phoenix, Annie was helping her grandmother fold laundry when Hank's old radio crackled with the midday news bulletin. Questions surrounding Whitmore's leadership have resurfaced following recent board tensions. Annie paused mid-fold. She knew that name, knew that voice. Her grandmother lowered the volume slowly. Sometimes, she said gently, when you stand for something, folks go digging. Annie didn't fully understand, but she felt something shift. Back in Manhattan, Martin Hale stood before a small group of shareholders in a private conference suite. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply distributed printed copies of the article. Leadership, he said evenly, requires consistency. One investor frowned. This is decades old. History doesn't expire, Hale replied. He never once said he had leaked it. He did not need to. That afternoon, Whitmore boarded a private jet not to Europe, not to Silicon Valley, but to Ohio. He did not bring press. He did not issue statements. He simply flew. Ridgeway was smaller than Annie had imagined when she later saw photos online. Brick buildings, boarded storefronts, a main street that looked like it had once believed in parades. Whitmore walked alone to the old plant site. The gates were rusted now, the sign long gone. Grass had overtaken the parking lot. He stood there for a long time. 22 years earlier, he had been 38, brilliant, ambitious, certain. Ridgeway Components had been hemorrhaging money. Global suppliers were cheaper. The board had presented numbers. He had recommended closure. It had been strategic, logical, efficient. 600 people had lost jobs. At the time, he had told himself the market demanded it. That adaptation was survival. That individual hardship, while unfortunate, was not his responsibility. Now, standing before the hollow remains of what had once fed families, he wasn't so certain. A voice interrupted his thoughts. You looking for something? Whitmore turned. An older man stood behind him, work boots caked with mud, jacket faded from years of weather. I used to work here, the man said. Whitmore nodded slowly. I know. Recognition dawned in the man's eyes. You're him. Whitmore didn't deny it. Yes. The wind moved across the empty lot. You cost me my pension, the man said plainly. Whitmore did not look away. I did. No excuse. No corporate language. Just fact. The man studied him carefully. You here to apologize? Whitmore considered the question. I'm here to understand. A dry laugh escaped the man. Bit late. Yes. They stood in silence. Finally, the man spoke again. My daughter moved to Arizona after the plant shut down. Said she'd find work there. Phoenix. Whitmore felt something tighten. Phoenix, he repeated. Yeah, the man said. Funny thing is, she ended up meeting good people. Community helped her. Said sometimes losing one thing leads you somewhere you didn't expect. Whitmore nodded faintly. Sometimes, he agreed. When he returned to Manhattan the next day, the media cycle had intensified. Pundits debated his evolution. Shareholders questioned his moral consistency. Martin Hale requested an emergency board session. In Phoenix, Annie watched a television interview from the small couch in the garage living quarters. A reporter asked sharply, Mr. Whitmore, how do you reconcile advocating for community investment now when your early career decisions devastated one? Whitmore did not deflect. I made a decision based purely on financial metrics, he said calmly. It was legal. It was strategic. It was profitable. And it was incomplete. The room fell quiet. Incomplete? The reporter pressed. I did not understand the full cost, Whitmore continued. Numbers measure revenue. They do not measure dignity. Annie's grandmother turned up the volume slightly. Whitmore continued, steady but unguarded. I cannot undo Ridgeway. I cannot return pensions or reopen that plant, but I can choose differently now. In the boardroom, Hale watched the same broadcast. He expected defensiveness. He expected corporate polish. He did not expect confession. After the interview, Whitmore issued a statement announcing a new initiative, a $200 million domestic reinvestment fund, focused on rebuilding manufacturing partnerships in towns previously impacted by outsourcing, including Ridgeway, not as charity, as equity partnerships. As ownership models, the stock dipped briefly, then stabilized. In Phoenix, Annie sat quietly. Grandma? Yes, baby. Was he wrong back then? Her grandmother folded the last towel. Yes. Annie nodded slowly. Is he wrong now? Her grandmother thought carefully. No. Annie looked toward the garage where Hank was tuning an engine. So people can change? Her grandmother smiled gently. If they're brave enough to face what they broke. That evening, Whitmore called Hank. You didn't have to fly there, Hank said. Yes, Whitmore replied quietly. I did. Silence held for a moment. They're trying to make it look like you're pretending to be something new, Hank said. I am something new, Whitmore answered. In Manhattan, Martin Hale closed his office door. The exposure had not fractured Whitmore. It had strengthened him. Public vulnerability had become unexpected armor. Hale stared out at the city lights. He understood now that dismantling Whitmore would require something far more precise than scandal. It would require turning trust itself into doubt. And trust, once shaken inside a community, could collapse everything far faster than a leaked article ever could. The fracture did not begin with shouting. It began with a rumor. 3 weeks after Daniel Whitmore's reinvestment fund announcement, a black SUV rolled slowly down the cracked side street in South Phoenix where Carter's auto garage stood like a stubborn memory of another era. The vehicle did not stop. It only passed. But someone noticed the logo on its door. Whitmore Mobility. By noon, the neighborhood Facebook group was alive. They're buying up small shops. Corporate takeover coming. First Ridgeway, now us. Hank first heard about it from Pastor Lewis, who stopped by mid-afternoon with a concerned crease between his brows. You planning to sell? The pastor asked gently. Hank wiped his hands on a rag. Sell what? The garage. Hank blinked. Why in heaven's name would I do that? Pastor Lewis hesitated. Folks are saying Whitmore's people have been surveying properties, that once the upgrades are done, ownership transfers. Hank's jaw tightened. That's nonsense. But even as he said it, he felt the old ache of doubt because contracts, once signed, live longer than handshakes. Inside the small living quarters behind the garage, Annie sat at the table coloring when her grandmother's phone buzzed repeatedly. Voices in the kitchen rose, tense, whispered, the kind adults use when they think children aren't listening. Grandma? Annie asked softly. Her grandmother forced a smile. Just grown-up noise, baby. But Annie had learned something from engines. Noise usually meant something underneath. Across the country, Martin Hale reviewed a carefully drafted internal memo. He did not write it. He simply approved its release. The memo outlined a long-term vertical integration strategy, referencing potential acquisition of community-level service providers aligned with Whitmore Mobility infrastructure. It was technical, ambiguous, legally harmless, and devastating in interpretation. Because leaked out of context, it sounded like expansion at the expense of independence. By evening, a local reporter stood outside Carter's garage with a camera crew. Mr. Carter, she called. Can you comment on whether your partnership with Daniel Whitmore includes future sale agreements? Hank stared at the microphone as if it were a snake. There is no sale, he said firmly. This garage belongs to my family. But is there a clause allowing corporate buyout? Hank's voice sharpened. No. Inside, Annie watched from behind the window curtain. She had never seen her grandfather look unsure in front of strangers. He wasn't unsure about the garage. He was unsure about being believed. That night, Whitmore received a call from his communications director. It's spreading fast, she said. Community takeover narrative, Ridgeway comparisons. We need a statement. Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. Did we initiate any property assessments near Carter's? No. Then where did this come from? Silence lingered on the line. We're tracing the leak, she said carefully. Whitmore knew that tone. He had used it himself years ago. Controlled damage, contained uncertainty. The next morning, Hank sat at the small kitchen table. Contract spread before him like an accusation. He read every line again. There was no transfer clause, no hidden option, no corporate backdoor. The renovation agreement was simple. Investment in exchange for public brand partnership and shared community programming. Nothing more. He exhaled slowly. Across town, a small group of local mechanics gathered outside a diner. They always say partnership, one muttered. Until the papers change. My cousin's shop in Nevada got swallowed like that, another added. Fear spreads faster than facts. By mid-afternoon, foot traffic at Carter's slowed. Regulars hesitated. Some waved but didn't stop. Trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly. It thins. Whitmore arrived unannounced that evening. No press, no entourage, just a rental set-in. He stepped inside the garage as Hank adjusted a carburetor. You picked a rough week to visit, Hank said without looking up. I know. Hank set the tool down deliberately. You planning to own this place someday? Whitmore met his gaze. No. You swear it? Yes. Hank held the silence longer than comfortable. I signed because you promised investment, not control. And you have it, Whitmore said. From the doorway, Annie watched. She felt the tension like humidity before a storm. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly. He turned. Did you tell people you're buying us? No. Then why do they think that? Whitmore crouched slightly so his eyes met hers. Because sometimes, he said carefully, when someone powerful makes a mistake in the past, People expect it again. Annie considered that. So even if you're different now, they're waiting for you to be the same? Yes, Hank exhaled. Then don't talk, he said firmly. Show. The next day, Whitmore declined every media request. Instead, he transferred legal ownership of all renovation assets directly to Hank's name, equipment, infrastructure, upgrades, even the new diagnostic systems, no shared title, no conditional clauses. Then he publicly released the full contract, unedited, transparent. Carter's garage remains fully independent, the statement read. Whitmore Mobility holds no acquisition rights. Investment does not equal ownership. The stock dipped slightly, again, but something else shifted. That evening, Pastor Lewis stood at the front of his small church and addressed the congregation. Trust, he said, is not proven by words. It's proven by surrendering control. Hank stood in the back pew. Whitmore sat beside him quietly. The following morning, customers returned. Not all at once, but steadily. Mrs. Alvarez brought tamales as thanks. Mr. Green asked about brake pads like nothing had happened, and Annie sat on an overturned bucket, listening to the familiar rhythm of engines and neighbors. Whitmore stepped outside briefly to take a call. On the other end, Martin Hale spoke calmly. You handled that well, Hale said. I told the truth, Whitmore replied. Transparency can be dangerous. So can secrets. Hale paused. You're earning loyalty, he observed. Whitmore's voice lowered slightly. I'm not earning it, he said. I'm repairing what I broke long before I met them. After the call ended, Whitmore looked back into the garage. Annie was laughing at something her grandfather said. The sound was unguarded. Real. Trust had not shattered. But someone had tried to crack it, and that meant the threat was no longer public. It was strategic. The exposure did not arrive with sirens. It arrived with silence. 2 days after the community stabilized, Whitmore's legal counsel requested a private meeting in Manhattan. The tone in her voice was careful, controlled in a way that meant something had already been confirmed. Whitmore returned from Phoenix that morning. He had left before sunrise, standing quietly for a moment outside Carter's garage while Hank unlocked the doors. Storm's not over, Hank had said. Whitmore nodded. I know. In Manhattan, the conference room felt colder than usual. 3 people waited, his general counsel, the head of compliance, and an outside forensic analyst. No small talk, no coffee poured. The analyst turned his laptop around. We traced the memo leak, he said. On the screen glowed a digital map of internal document access, timestamps, IP logs, authorization chains. The memo had not been hacked. It had been downloaded. Internally. Whitmore leaned forward slightly. By who? The cursor circled a name. Martin Hale. The room held its breath. Whitmore did not blink. Proof? He asked calmly. The analyst clicked another window. Email correspondence routed through a private intermediary firm. Metadata linking the anonymous blog submission to a consulting group long associated with Hale's previous ventures. It's airtight, counsel said quietly. If we move forward, Whitmore sat back slowly. 20 years of partnership, board battles, strategic disagreements, and now this. He wanted fracture, Whitmore murmured. Yes, counsel replied. Specifically, in Phoenix. Whitmore understood. Undermine his credibility. Disrupt the community investment narrative. Force board reconsideration under the guise of shareholder protection. Hale had not attacked with noise. He had attacked with doubt. That afternoon, Whitmore requested a full board session. Not emergency, not dramatic. Scheduled, formal. Martin Hale arrived precisely on time, composed, unhurried. He took his seat at the long glass table, nodding politely at fellow members. Whitmore entered last. He did not carry notes. He did not project slides. He simply stood at the head of the table. Before we begin quarterly projections, he said evenly, there's a matter of internal conduct. Hale's expression did not shift. Whitmore gestured lightly to the analyst, who distributed printed evidence packets. Silence thickened as pages turned. IP addresses, forwarded drafts, intermediary invoices. A timeline too precise to dispute. Hale closed his folder slowly. You're making a serious accusation, he said. Whitmore met his eyes. No, he replied. I'm presenting documentation. A board member cleared her throat. Martin? Hale remained composed. This company, he began carefully, was built on disciplined growth. Strategic advantage. Not sentimental reinvention. Daniel's recent decisions expose us to instability. So you destabilized us first? Another member asked sharply. Hale's voice tightened. I acted to protect shareholder value. Whitmore spoke quietly. You acted to regain control. The room stilled. For years, Hale had been the architect behind the scenes. The numbers man. The quiet strategist. He leaned forward now. You are changing the company's direction without consensus, Hale said. Investing in emotional narratives instead of market dominance. Whitmore's expression did not harden. It's not emotional to measure full cost, he said. Hale's composure flickered just briefly. You've allowed a 6-year-old garage story to influence a billion-dollar enterprise. Whitmore did not raise his voice. I've allowed conscience to influence it. That word landed heavier than accusation. Conscience. Several board members shifted in their seats. One spoke carefully. Martin, did you leak the memo? Hale did not answer immediately. Silence often protects, but sometimes it condemns. Finally, he said, I facilitated information the public had a right to question. Whitmore nodded once. Then you resign. It was not shouted. It was not theatrical. It was final. The board voted, not unanimously, but decisively. Martin Hale gathered his folder without visible emotion. At the door, he paused. Your gambling legacy on redemption, he said to Whitmore. Whitmore held his gaze. No, he replied quietly. I'm building legacy on responsibility. Hale left without another word. By evening, an internal announcement confirmed his departure, effective immediately due to breach of fiduciary trust. No scandal, no spectacle, just accountability. In Phoenix, Hank closed the garage for the night as Annie finished stacking small wrenches in size order. Grandpa, she asked softly, what happens when someone breaks trust on purpose? Hank leaned against the workbench. They lose the right to hold it, even if they helped build something big. Especially then. Annie considered that. So, being important doesn't mean you're right? Hank smiled faintly. No, ma'am. Being right usually means you're willing to lose something important. Later that evening, Whitmore called. It's done, he said simply. Hank didn't ask for details. You all right? Yes. A pause lingered. Trust almost cracked us, Hank said. I know, but it didn't. Whitmore's voice softened slightly. No. After the call ended, Whitmore stood alone in his office, city lights blinking below like distant signals. He had not defeated Hale with exposure. He had defeated him with evidence. Not vengeance. Accountability. He understood now something he had not grasped 20 years ago in Ridgeway. Power without conscience corrodes. Conscience without action is decoration. But conscience defended by action becomes leadership. In Phoenix, Annie looked up at the night sky through the open garage door. The desert air felt calmer. Engines rested. Neighbors waved goodnight. She didn't understand corporate boards, or leaked memos, or shareholder votes. But she understood something simple. When someone tries to break something good, you fix it. And sometimes fixing it means telling the truth, even if the truth costs someone their position. The storm had not destroyed the garage. It had revealed who was willing to protect it. Chapter 18. The desert winter came gently that year. Not with snow, not with storms, but with cool mornings that carried the scent of dust and coffee and something steadier than before. Carter's auto garage no longer looked tired. The cracked concrete had been leveled. The hand-painted sign remained at Hank's insistence, but it was framed now by clean brickwork and new lighting that glowed warmly after sunset. Inside, the tools hung in ordered precision. The diagnostic system hummed quietly in the corner, not as a corporate invasion, but as an instrument in experienced hands. Nothing about the place felt owned. It felt strengthened. Annie sat cross-legged on the shop floor, carefully polishing a small metal plaque she had insisted on helping design. It wasn't flashy, just brushed steel, mounted near the entrance. Carter's Auto Garage. Family-owned since 1987. Community partner. Whitmore Mobility Initiative. Underneath, in smaller lettering Hank had approved after long silence. Trust is built here. Daniel Whitmore stood beside him as the final screws were tightened into the brick. You sure about that last line? Whitmore asked quietly. Hank nodded. Most garages promise horsepower, he said. We promise something rarer. Whitmore gave a faint smile. Across the country, Whitmore Mobility's reinvestment fund had begun its work. Not flashy ribbon cuttings, not photo ops, quiet contracts, shared equity agreements, small town plants reopening under cooperative models. In Ridgeway, Ohio, ground had been broken for a new manufacturing facility, employee-owned, partially funded by Whitmore's personal capital, not the company's. The press had called it redemption. Whitmore never used that word. Redemption suggests erasing the past. He had learned you cannot erase it. You can only respond to it. In Phoenix, a modest ceremony had been arranged at the garage one Saturday afternoon. Folding chairs lined the lot. Pastor Lewis offered prayer. Mrs. Alvarez brought enough food for 3 neighborhoods. Even the skeptical mechanics from the diner showed up, leaning against trucks with folded arms that slowly unfolded. Whitmore stood at the front, not behind a podium, just on the pavement. I made decisions years ago, he began calmly, that measured success by numbers alone. No defensiveness, no polished rhetoric. Numbers matter, he continued. But they don't hold doors open for neighbors. They don't teach grandchildren how to use a wrench. They don't carry memory. He paused, glancing toward Annie, who was sitting on an overturned bucket beside her grandfather. This garage reminded me of that. Hank shifted slightly, uncomfortable with praise. Whitmore continued, leadership isn't about never failing. It's about answering for your failures without hiding behind position. The crowd remained quiet, not dazzled, listening. I cannot change Ridgeway, he said, but I can choose how Whitmore Mobility behaves from this day forward. Annie looked up at her grandfather. Grandpa, she whispered. That's like fixing something instead of pretending it wasn't broken. Hank smiled faintly. Yes, ma'am. After the ceremony, as dusk settled softly over South Phoenix, Whitmore lingered by the garage entrance. Why'd you really stay? Hank asked him. Whitmore considered the question. When Annie first told me she could fix my car, he said slowly. I saw risk. Hank nodded. I saw liability, reputation damage, headlines. And now, Whitmore looked toward Annie, who was helping Mrs. Alvarez carry foil trays inside. Now I see what I didn't measure. Which is, potential doesn't come wrapped in credentials, Whitmore said. Sometimes it's wearing grease-stained overalls. Hank chuckled under his breath. You almost walked away that first day. I did walk away. But you came back. Whitmore nodded. Yes, because somewhere between pride and urgency, between doubt and dusk, he had looked at the sky and realized something simple. Running forward does not mean running right. Sometimes the bravest turn is the one that takes you back. Later that evening, after the last of the chairs were folded and the garage lights dimmed, Annie sat alone on the front step with her grandmother. Grandma? Yes, baby? Are bad people always bad? Her grandmother brushed a loose braid from Annie's forehead. No. Are good people always good? No, she said gently. We're all both. Depending on what we choose when it costs us. Annie thought about that. Mr. Whitmore chose to stay, she said. Yes, and he chose to tell the truth. Yes, and he chose to fix what he broke. Her grandmother smiled. That's called character. Across town, Whitmore stood on the balcony of a modest hotel instead of his usual penthouse suite. He preferred distance tonight, not from the community, but from applause. His phone buzzed. A message from Ridgeway's new plant director. First hiring round complete. 180 positions filled. Former employees prioritized. Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. Not redemption. Responsibility. He typed back a simple response. Thank you. Continue steady. The desert air felt cooler now. Cleaner. In the months that followed, Carter's garage expanded not in size, but in purpose. Hank began hosting Saturday workshops for young mechanics who couldn't afford formal trade school. Whitmore funded scholarships quietly, without attaching his name. Annie grew taller, still curious, still listening to engines before anyone else noticed the subtle misfires. One afternoon, nearly a year after the breakdown that started it all, a sleek electric vehicle rolled cautiously into the lot. The driver stepped out confident, well-dressed, impatient. I need someone qualified, he said briskly. Annie looked up from beneath the hood of a pickup truck. I can fix it, she said. The man glanced at Hank. Hank folded his arms but didn't speak. Whitmore, who happened to be visiting that day, watched quietly from the side. The man hesitated, looked at Annie, then at the garage, then at the plaque near the door. Trust is built here. He exhaled. All right, he said slowly. Show me. Whitmore caught Hank's eye. Hank gave the faintest nod. Legacy isn't measured in buildings, or stock prices, or even court victories. It's measured in moments repeated differently than before. The first time, a billionaire shook his head at a little girl. The last time, a stranger chose to believe her. As the sun lowered once more over South Phoenix, engines hummed, neighbors laughed, and Annie's small hands moved with quiet certainty beneath the hood of a machine twice her size. You can steal reputation, you can shake trust, you can even close doors, but you cannot erase the lesson taught in a humble garage. Power proves nothing, character proves everything, and some lessons once learned reshape more than a single life. They reshape the road ahead. This story reminds us that true character is revealed not when life is easy, but when pride, power, and reputation are on the line. It teaches that real leadership is not about titles, wealth, or control. It is about accountability, humility, and the courage to repair what has been broken. Through Annie's quiet confidence and Daniel Whitmore's willingness to confront his past, we see that trust cannot be bought, only earned through consistent action. The message to the audience is clear. Never underestimate the overlooked. Never ignore the quiet wisdom of the humble. And never believe it is too late to choose integrity over ego. Real legacy is not built on success alone, but on the courage to stand for what is right even when it costs you something. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.